Good morning from WKYT News. I'm Bill Bryant, and we welcome you to Kentucky Newsmakers. Later, we'll talk with WKYT Chief Meteorologist Chris Bailey about how the month of February set records and what we should prepare for now as we head into spring severe weather season. That's a little bit later, but first on Kentucky Newsmakers, schools across the Commonwealth are dealing with lots of uncertainty right now, including funding, the pensions that employees will get, and safety in the wake of school shootings and threats. Our first guest also heads up a fast-growing school system that right now includes the largest high school in the state. Dr. Kevin Hubb is superintendent in Scott County. He's closing in on 30 years in education, was previously superintendent in Logan County, and for many years before that he was a teacher and administrator in Madison County. Dr. Hubb is also a West Point graduate and a Desert Storm veteran who was awarded the Bronze Star. We welcome Superintendent Hubb to Kentucky Newsmakers. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
And I do want to say thanks for your service to the country. And as you have told me, some of the folks that you served with say you continue in public service with what you're doing.
Well, I appreciate that. And as we talked earlier, you know, July 1st, 1985, I took an oath that said I would agree to a lifetime of selfless service to the nation. And, you know, my West Point classmate soldiers who are still in are appreciative of my service to education because it's just as valuable to our nation.
Teaching is a noble public calling. You believe that? I
do believe that. I'm so fortunate to be in education. I've been in education. This is my 24th year, and I love to come every day.
We know the current Kentucky budget situation is tough. We also saw in the latter part of the week that it is a fluid situation with now a new House bill coming out, a budget bill that proposes to raise some revenue and also to eliminate some of the cuts that some were so concerned about. Of course, it's a long way from law at this point. You at one point seem to be raising the specter that the legislature has to live up to certain constitutional requirements.
Yeah, I think it's clear that our Kentucky Constitution says that the General Assembly has a responsibility to adequately fund public education. And I'm not sure that the record would reflect that they're doing so.
In 1989, there was a lawsuit. It threw out the system of common schools in Kentucky because it said for that reason the schools are not being adequately funded by the legislature. Are we anywhere near a tipping point like that again?
I think we are. Just a couple of years ago, Toyota in Georgetown celebrated a very successful 30-year anniversary. I'm not sure that Cara would have had a successful 30-year anniversary, and I think there are many in the state that are, especially when you look at the inadequacies in funding. I think when you look at those, I think there are many that think it's time for us to relook at the constitutionality of Kentucky education.
What do you see it costing Kentucky children and our schools?
Well, I think it costs our Kentucky children every single day. I think what happens is we are required and we're asked to expect more of our education professionals, but we diminish the resources that we give them. And that's not fair to children. So what happens on the local level is we have to keep raising our taxes. That's not fair to our local communities, but we find that in most of our local communities, they support that because they know that education is the foundation here in Kentucky.
I mean, do you feel that Frankfort lawmakers basically tell the local governments in a way, you need to be the one that raises the taxes on the local level?
Well, I think we see in the House version of the budget that there are 3 revenue-raising opportunities. There's an increase in cigarette tax, an opioid tax, and an increase in $10 for a personal credit income tax. It's suggested to raise $250 million, and all of us know that that's not near enough. But every single year, they expect superintendents to look at their board members. And remember, all of our school board members are also elected officials, and they expect us to have us raise local taxes, except the General Assembly doesn't seem to be willing to travel down that path themselves.
There is talk of some tax reform now from the House before the end of this session. It might change things. It might go after areas that maybe the revenue code is missing in the economy that has changed so much since it was put in place. From where you sit, does that need to be done?
I think so. One of the things that I do appreciate hearing from Governor Bevin and Secretary Heiner is that Kentucky is open for business. And I think new business opportunities in Kentucky is better for every community in Kentucky. But I think that we're not going to attract new businesses if we don't have a solid foundation built on education. And the governor's budget was slashing our Kentucky Teacher Internship Program. That is one of the most important things we can do for our first-year teachers. cutting instructional resources, cutting technology, how can we possibly make Kentucky open for business? So I think there have to be additional revenue streams to support that foundation that is so important for business all across Kentucky, because if we bring business to Kentucky, that's better paying jobs for Kentuckians, and that's going to help the entire Commonwealth.
Dr. Hub, we've all seen some maps floating around that show that many schools could become quickly insolvent if the revenue cuts were to stay in place, especially those to transportation budgets, that kind of thing. You've indicated to me Scott County is robust enough to keep going for a time, but it would be difficult for all, huh?
Oh, I think it is difficult. So in Scott County schools, we've had boards of education that for years have concentrated on being very fiscally responsible, so we're a strong fiscal district. But even in Scott County, the budget cuts that are proposed won't cause us to eliminate programs or lay off staff, but we are not able to provide that world-class education that our community expects. I think all of us understand that more children are coming to us on the autism spectrum. More children are coming to us with increased behavior needs, increased mental health needs. We're not able to fund those support specialists. That's where it hurts a fiscally responsible and a fiscally sound district like Scott County. But there are dozens of districts all across Kentucky that they're even beyond that. They are now not only eliminating waste, but they are having to eliminate critical positions in every school, and that's impacting every child in the Commonwealth.
As you know, some school systems are criticized for being heavy on administrative costs. Again, as you look at operating school systems, and you have kind of a statewide view, having served in another district and talking with a lot of your folks that are in the same business, do you believe that to be the case?
I don't believe it to be the case. I think, you know, the governor pointed out in his address to the Commonwealth, Fayette County and Jefferson County, and the enormous amount of administrators that they have on the books. Well, nearly 3/4 or more of those administrators in those two districts are in schools where students need them to be. Teachers want additional administrators because we just talked about there aren't enough support specialists, behavior specialists, mental health specialists. So those responsibilities fall on the administrators, the guidance counselors, the school psychologists, and the assistant principals in the building. The governor also mentioned that some of our budget line items were out of whack, the amount that we spend on district administration compared to the amount that we spend on student instruction. In Scott County, when we look at the district administrative budget, and remember that in Kentucky, we are told through our Munis accounting system how to book all revenues and all expenses. Every district, every 173 districts, books them the same way. 2/3 of the expenses in Scott County district administration, you know, that cost that makes us look like we're so overfunded, those are the fees that we pay to Sheriff Hampton in Scott County to collect our tax revenues. There's not much money that's more well spent in Kentucky. And when you talk about tax revenues, we circle back to these districts that are in such financial trouble. In eastern Kentucky, there are many districts that we hear that are only collecting 55%, 42%, 38% of their local tax revenue. Families are just having to choose between paying local tax revenues or putting food on the table for their children. And how are these districts who are getting hit with state budget cuts and now they're getting hit with lack of local revenue, how are they possibly going to survive?
And that worries you?
Oh, it concerns all of us in Kentucky. It doesn't just concern those superintendents in eastern Kentucky and western Kentucky and those that are hit with local economic downturns. It impacts all of us in Kentucky.
You are spending this weekend at the Kentucky School Board Association, and you're doing some presentations there, and one of those has to do with what has come to be known as the recallable nickel, and that is that the local districts do have the ability to put on a special nickel tax for a time while they get some projects done, and you've done that in two different districts.
You know, it's been great to have been supported twice by boards who knew that what was best for the community is an increase in facility funding. It's important to clarify that recallable nickel revenue only can be spent on facility funding. In Logan County, back in January, they just opened a $20 million area technology center, a vocational school that will impact that area for generations. In Scott County, our recallable nickel is what we need to build a $70 million high school. This year, there are 13 districts that in the last biennium have been supported by their communities, and they've been able to effectively levy this recallable nickel. Not in the governor's budget, but in the latest House version of the budget, the recallable nickels were equalized. And basically, it's not a match dollar for dollar, but it's money from the state that is able to generate additional revenue for those districts.
That can be subject to a local vote, right, of the people?
It can be subject to a local vote. But for those 13 districts, it's already been passed and it's on the books. They've gotten that additional local revenue. When our tax bills went out in the fall of 17, that increase was on there.
In those cases where it does go to a vote, and we've seen many of them defeated
Yes, sir.
at the polling place, how do the schools convince people who do not have children in the school district at the time to vote for it?
Well, I think that's the silver bullet, if you will. Most communities, their demographics shell out in the sense that nearly 70% of the people in districts do not have children in school. So you hit on the most critical strategic piece of levying taxes. And in both communities, I think transparency, authenticity, and most importantly, a plan for how that money is going to be spent is some of the things that I'm going to share with a couple hundred board members this weekend when they're in the presentation, that's best to sway the community to see the need. I think districts that try to levy a recallable nickel simply to pay for much needed repairs, they find themselves less successful.
Does the fact that it sunsets when the mission is completed make it more palatable to some?
Well, I think the fact that it sunsets makes it palatable to the General Assembly.
Yeah.
The first time that it was ever sunset was in the 2016 biennium, and quite honestly, at the last hour of the last day of the session, I had a conversation with then Senate President Pro Tem, Senator David Givens, and he remarked that, you know, we don't have the votes. We're not sure that our members can support this equalization for perpetuity. And I suggested we sunset it in 20 years, the length of a municipal bond, because let's use Scott County. The $10 million will fund the athletic facilities at Gray Crossing High School. Once that bond is paid for, I am perfectly okay with ending the obligation for the state to equalize. Now, go ahead.
Finish
well,
up.
and I was going to say, what's nice is, remember, we're early in the process, and so far it's just been the House that has approved equalization of the nickel. What I'm hopeful is that Senator Stivers, Senator Thayer, and Senator Wilson, 3 state senators in leadership positions who will have an opportunity to influence the budget twice, not only in the Senate, but also in the combined Budget Conference Committee. I'm hopeful that those 3 senators will use their leadership. Their local voters have said this tax is important, so I'm hopeful that they will approve equalization of those nickels when it gets to them.
Dr. Kevin Hub is with us. He is superintendent of the Scott County School System, also a leader among superintendents across our state. We're back in a moment. We'll talk about school security and the concerns that a lot of school workers have right now about their pensions, that and more. And the meteorologist Chris Bailey, a little bit later, our chief meteorologist, talking about the spring severe weather season. We welcome you back to WKYT's Kentucky Newsmakers. Delighted to be visiting with Dr. Kevin Hub, who is the superintendent of the Scott County School System today, and he's schooling us on some education issues, and we're enjoying learning. The pension issue is also bubbling out there, Dr. Hub, no doubt. Kentucky's on the hook for tens of millions of dollars that has not been set aside. This governor has said this cannot be kicked down the road any longer, and he's trying to get it addressed. There is a provision, or a proposal called Senate Bill 1 that is something different from what he proposed. The Attorney General sent out a 6-page letter to lawmakers telling them that the pension reform that's being proposed goes too far.
Well, I think we've seen 3 versions so far. So back in the fall, we saw the governor's plan keeping the promise. We saw Senate Bill 1, and earlier this week we saw a Senate committee substitute of Senate Bill 1 that does go a little bit better. One thing that's clear is that so far the General Assembly appears to be listening to educators, state government workers all across Kentucky who are saying you can't do this to us. It's too deep a cut. Where are the revenue increases that are also going to help? I appreciate that the governor and the General Assembly sees this as a problem. It's a problem that Kentucky needs to solve. It's hitting all of us. It's hitting us in Kentucky because we have such a low credit rating. We've sold bonds twice in Scott County, and with the help of our fiscal agent, the folks at Hilliard Lyons, we have sought a separate Moody's rating twice. Both times, and I think it's due to the fiscal soundness of the community of Georgetown and Scott County schools, both times we got a credit rating higher than the state of Kentucky.
Which would drag you down if you went with them.
It would drag you down. It'd cost you more interest and more payments. And Kentucky businesses all across Kentucky, if they're not able to have a separate rating, they're tied to this low Kentucky rating. We've got to solve the pension issue, but we can't do it on the backs of these employees.
And how much is it in the backs of the minds, and how disruptive is it to teachers and school staff who are trying to work while all this is going on, and they don't know how it's going to end up?
I think it's big. I had a chance, I was reading to some kindergarten students the other day, and there was a student teacher in the classroom. So somebody finishing up her undergraduate classes, getting ready to enter the profession of education. So I asked her, what is looming on the minds of you and your classmates regarding education now that it seems that the retirement system has been pulled out from under you? What she says is, I love education. I love kids. As we talked earlier, it's a calling, and I'm still going to be a teacher, but I'm going to have to find a way. Maybe it's a second job, maybe it's a third job, maybe it's additional duties in education to supplement my retirement, because it's not going to be the same as I'm led to believe. And it's certainly an issue with our newer teachers, because whether the threshold cuts off and changes the rule below those with 20 years experience or not, it's still different. And this is where I believe Attorney General Beshear comes from, is that today, every single employee that I have in Scott County Schools is under an inviolable contract. There's one for the certified employees, there's one for the classified employees. Those contracts currently exist, and in every single form of pension reform that we've seen, in the Attorney General's opinion, and certainly I would agree with him, violate both inviolable contracts.
We'll see where that all goes. School security in the news with the deadly shootings in Florida and, of course, out in western Kentucky. Those have been followed by dozens of threats around Kentucky. How disruptive have those threats been?
Those threats are disruptive to student learning daily. Students are scared, parents are scared, communities are scared. I think what we need to do locally is do the best we can, put policies and procedures in place that do the very best we can to protect our students. In Scott County Schools, I sleep well at night. I'm confident that our students are safe every day when they come to school.
And this is an area where you believe in local control. Pike County is going to allow teachers to carry and conceal. For instance, the school board's voted for that.
They have voted for that.
You defend their right to make that decision?
What's great in Kentucky is, yes, we have local control. I think the world of Superintendent Reed Atkins, and I know if him and his board have made that decision, that's what they believe is best for students in Pike County. In Scott County Schools, we're not forced to follow them. We're not forced to take an opposite direction. Nobody in Scott County has come to me and said we need to consider conceal and carry. In Scott County, our view is we need fewer guns in school, not more.
And you use resource officers?
We have school resource officers. We have one from the city of Georgetown, and we have a sheriff's deputy from the sheriff's department in Scott County.
Does that approach seem to be the best to you, to have armed police on campus?
Well, I think guns are only as good as the people who hold them, and it takes more skill than simply knowing how to pull the trigger. That's not a burden I want to place on 1,500 education professionals. I want law enforcement professionals too. If there ever is a crisis, let them be the ones who have to make a decision whether or not to shoot and kill. You're
superintendent of the fastest growing county in Kentucky, and Scott County will open up a new high school. It's Great Crossings High next year, as well as Creekside Elementary School. We were mentioning it took a lot of work to bring those projects along, but they are coming up over there.
They are coming up over there, and the community is excited. Kids are excited. In August of 2019, we are going to open both of those schools. We are fortunate in the Commonwealth to be one of those districts that are growing. So many Kentucky districts don't have that opportunity. We're just fortunate, and I think we're doing the things that we need to do to stay ahead of that pace. I think it's possible, and we've already talked to the board about, we're opening these two schools in 2019. It's entirely possible that we'll open 2 more elementary schools in 2021.
Wow. Senator Thayer is in favor of allowing school calendars to be adjusted by many schools, 168 student days, and that I think one district's already going in that direction. Do you see that as a trend?
Well, it's another opportunity where local control is outstanding. Dr. Benny Lyle, Superintendent Metcalfe County, again, another outstanding educator who does what's best for kids. I'm sure Metcalfe County has decided that decision is best for them. Senator Thayer and I have clearly in the public been on opposite sides of this issues. I ran some numbers. In Scott County, if we were to mimic the calendar that Metcalfe County Board of Education approved, we would be spending more than $4 million in salaries to our certified and our classified staff for them to work on days when children aren't in schools. Now, certainly the alternative is to simply cut their pay 10%, but none of us would consider that. I just don't think that that's best for kids. And I also go back to, in the hottest days of the year, in the dog days of August, I want children in Scott County schools because we have air conditioning in schools, and many of our children get their breakfast, lunch, and dinner, the best meals of the day. They get them from Scott County schools.
Superintendent Hubb, thanks for coming. We appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you for having me.
Stay here with us on Kentucky Newsmakers. We'll talk with Chief Meteorologist Chris Bailey, looking ahead to spring and back at winter, such as it was in February. Coming next on Kentucky Newsmakers. Welcome back to Kentucky Newsmakers on WKYT, and I've moved over to the First Alert Severe Weather Center. Severe a lot of times, anyway, right? The Weather Center.
Absolutely.
Nobody's saying winter's over. This is Kentucky and things happen, but it is now March and a chance to look ahead to spring. We're leaving behind a historic February. We had flooding and ice and some snow, and we get into March. We're reminded that some tougher weather months could be coming about with the severe weather. WKYT Chief Meteorologist Chris Bailey predicted a winter that would be cold at the beginning, warm up toward the end.
Yeah.
You really hit this one.
It was actually one of those that worked out pretty good. And you know, we started out with some record cold into early January. We had one of the coldest stretches on record for Lexington, which is hard to believe. We put together, I believe, 12 or 13 days where you had temperatures hitting the single digits just in a 2-week period there in early January.
Not
which is
hard to believe for those who had broken pipes.
Right. Oh, my goodness. Absolutely.
Troubles, didn't we?
And, you know, and for snow lovers to get that much cold and you couldn't get the big snow, it was probably frustrating to a lot of those snow lovers out there.
Looking back at winter, we did have a white Christmas.
We did. It snowed Christmas. It snowed New Year's Eve, too. So we hit the you know, kind of the double on that one with snow on Christmas Eve and snow when we were singing Old Lang Syne to say hello to a brand new year. That was put together, Bill. This winter headline map was put together the first week of November. And, you know, obviously last winter it didn't take a whole lot to be colder and snowier because it didn't,
very mild.
You know, we didn't have much snow last year. Temperatures for the entire winter averaged out near normal, because February was the second warmest February on record for Lexington, behind only February of last year. So back-to-back years that were top two. And you had the cold start into the first half of January, and obviously that mild end when we had severe thunderstorms and all kinds of flooding issues over the past week and change.
Let's talk about February. It ended up being a record for rainfall, and we had flooding and tornadoes. What, 13 of those? 13
tornadoes just on Saturday into the wee hours of Sunday morning, central and western Kentucky, which, you know, those numbers are way, way up there. That's more than you would typically get in a springtime in some cases across Kentucky. We average roughly now 25 to 30 tornadoes for a calendar year in Kentucky. So we picked up 13 in one day in February, which kind of makes you worry about where we're going for the rest of the spring.
This last week, we look back at, it was a year ago since the tornadoes, the rough weather around Estill County.
100-mile-an-hour straight line winds. March 1st, you know, this time of year, you get a lot of extreme weather. You go back to 2015, about this time right now, we had another 1 to 2 foot snowstorm.
Remember that?
Back to back. It was coming on the heels of 1 to 2 feet of snow 2 weeks earlier. Then we had, obviously, the March 1st severe weather outbreak last year, March 2nd, 2012.
Eastern Kentucky.
Will always go down as one of the great all-time severe weather outbreaks. So this week is kind of up there.
As we're in severe season, there were the statewide tornado drills on Thursday. Successful. I mean, people at least have an opportunity to think what they would do, and that's important right now.
It is. Always good to have that severe weather safety plan. Schools, we know we have those there. It's also good to have them at home, too. Because, you know, think about it. You spend more time at home than you do anywhere else. So families, we want to have those severe weather safety plans set aside for you as well.
And what should that include?
It should include knowing exactly what to do when a warning is issued. You know, we tell people on air constantly, and often we'll get emails saying, why are you saying the same thing over and over? Well, because we're trying to reinforce into people what they need to be doing that could potentially save their lives at the moment. Lowest level, away from windows, away from, put as many walls between you and the outside as you possibly can. And it's all about protecting the head too. I mean, you know, we've got old helmets back here that sometimes we'll break out in a tornado event, you know, and I'll throw them on air and say, hey, this is what you need to be doing right now. Covering your head above all else. Doesn't matter about anything.
Know your safe place. Know where you're going to meet if everybody gets separated.
Yeah, absolutely. And have all the necessities that can get you through a few days. Where, you know, canned goods, water, some cash too.
Yeah. When you've, okay, so we know what happened in the winter. Does that give you any idea what we may be setting up for in the spring and summer? In
looking back, I approach seasonal forecasting, and I kind of look back at similar years and say, okay, here's what this year went on to do. And, you know, finding the true analog sometimes is hard to do. But this year tells me that we're in for a heck of a spring in terms of severe weather. We're long overdue for a big severe weather event in the spring. We haven't had one, to be honest with you, in that April-May time frame in years.
Right.
I mean, it's been since 2011 since we've had a true April-May severe weather setup. I think we're going into one this year.
All right, we'll be on watch, and we thank you. Appreciate you for talking with me.
Welcome, Bill.
And we want to thank you for joining us for this edition of Kentucky Newsmakers. I'll see you bright and early this week on WKYT This Morning, and you make it a good week ahead.